Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. So nice to have you with us on this Wednesday. Kevin Richert, how are you?
I'm good, Michelle. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, too. Kevin is always joining us for Making the Grade from Idaho Education News, where they are covering every kind of bit of education news you can possibly imagine coming out of the entire state of Idaho, although we tend to focus more locally. And Kevin, I had to start with the big news from last night and get your thoughts and opinions. The largest school district in Idaho has a new superintendent. The Board of Trustees naming Dr. Derek Bubb, who is the Centennial High School principal, as the new superintendent in West Ada. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that trustees wanted to go with somebody in-house, somebody who maybe is more familiar with what's been going on in the district in the past year with the pandemic, with the response to the pandemic, somebody who is, obviously going to be very well attuned to some of the growth issues that West Ada has faced over the past several years. So maybe not surprising that West Ada decided to look within with this hire.
That said, there was somebody else from within who was at the top of the four-person finalist list, and that was West Ada's assistant superintendent, who did not get the job. It's interesting to me to see the decision by the Board of Trustees and the comments that they made last night. They are certainly putting their weight behind Dr. Derek Bubb.
They certainly are. And, the mechanics of why you pick one internal candidate as opposed to another, I mean, that's a hard decision. But, at least in this case, you have trustees who are dealing with two known quantities.
Let's talk a little bit about the superintendent searches all across the state of Idaho. This is something we've discussed on Making the Grade before. There were perhaps, since we haven't necessarily covered this in years past, it certainly seemed like more superintendent openings across the state of Idaho than I certainly ever remember us talking about this year.
It feels that way. I mean, I think that's something we can try to quantify when it all shakes out here at the end of the school year. But it feels like there are more openings in some really large districts. I mean, West Ada being an example, Coeur d'Alene being an example up north, Idaho Falls is searching, is going to be replacing a longtime superintendent there. So some large districts, also a smattering of smaller districts. It does feel that way. And this is something that school officials, school groups have, expressed concern about, that because of the events of the past year, the challenges of the past year, that you might see more turnover.
What do you think the new superintendent of West Ada faces as he's coming into that job? Yes, he has boots on the ground, so to speak. You talked about growth. What are the biggest issues facing the West Ada School District as it gears up for next year and the uncertainty of next year, as this past year has been?
Right. I mean, you nailed it. It's the uncertainty of what can you do in terms of classroom instruction in the fall. And obviously everybody hopes that the next school year is going to look a lot more normal. But West Ada is still right in this growth mode, even though you saw enrollment drop off this past year because of the pandemic. No secret that entire school district, all of those communities are growing rapidly, more people moving in, that's going to be an issue that the district is going to be wrestling with for the foreseeable future.
Okay, let's talk about another issue that's being wrestled with and continues to be wrestled with. And of course, we have to be going to the State House, where the education budgets still on April 28th are not set, Kevin. So we're talking not only about the K-12 budget, but also the higher education budget. JFAC, the Joint Finance Committee, met yesterday to rewrite the language after there's been this back and forth of other bills that have come forward. So let's start with the major teacher salary bill. Where does that now stand?
Well, what came out of JFAC on Tuesday, maybe not surprisingly, is the same bottom line in terms of teacher pay that we saw earlier this month. If anything, actually, the budget is a little bit larger JFAC wound up putting another $1 million into this budget. It's a $1.1 billion budget, so $1 million is it's a small increase, but it's still $1 million that would go into teacher training. The salary component of this bill is unchanged from what we saw the first time around and what the House voted down. But you have to remember that when the House voted this bill down in the first place, the debate was really not about the sum of money. I don't think I recall a single legislator bringing up the dollar figure. In a debate about a budget bill, you would think that the dollar figure is where people are most focused on. This was really much more of a debate about social justice, the critical race theory issues that have kind of taken over the education debate this session. And that teacher salary bill got caught up in that debate over social justice. So the budget itself, very similar to what we saw earlier this month. And my sense is that it's really not a debate about the dollar figure. So maybe not surprising that the dollar figure remained more or less the same.
Actually increased, as you said.
Actually increased, yes.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit more in case people haven't been following the legislature moment by moment, day by day, as it continues into what could possibly be the longest legislative session in state history. But there's a reason behind why perhaps JFAC didn't necessarily rewrite this teacher salary bill so drastically. And if we back up, Kevin, that's because of it's called a, quote, non-discrimination bill that is now headed to the governor's desk. Can you talk a little bit about what this non-discrimination bill has in it and why this may help settle not monetary issues, but as you said, the social justice part of this debate?
Right. So this is the bill, House Bill 377, that has become the centerpiece of the education debate and it's become the centerpiece of the social justice debate. And what House Bill 377 essentially says is that schools cannot advance a line of thinking or compel students to adopt a line of thinking that attaches any superiority or inferiority to individuals based on race or gender. And it all goes back to this question of critical race theory in the schools. It mentions critical race theory. It doesn't necessarily outlaw discussion of critical race theory in the schools. So it's really kind of an unusual piece of legislation because it doesn't have a whole lot of compulsory language. It's more of a direction, more of a resolution in a lot of ways. And it's going at an issue that to a lot of Idahoans, that really hasn't resonated. We kind of keep going back to, well, where are the details? Where are the specifics? And what we heard on Monday in the debate in the Senate was that, well, to some degree, what we're trying to do with House Bill 377 is preventative. It's trying to get out ahead of something before it takes root in the schools. So it's really kind of an unusual debate, and it's been kind of a hard debate to pin down and focus in on details. But the bill, like you say, passed the Senate on nearly a party line vote, goes to the governor for his signature or veto. We'll see what happens there.
Was this the way for the legislators to get some of the language out that they wanted to and take it out of perhaps the budget bills where they had been playing with some of this language? Does it separate the two?
Yes, and I think that was part of the plan here. I mean, I think there were some legislators who did not want to address these topics in budget bills. There's traditionally a separation between policy bills and budget bills. This is like we were talking about with that teacher salary budget. You want budget bills and you want budget legislation to focus on funding and spending. And you want policy bills that come out of education committees, in this case, to focus on educational policy. So I think legislators trying to adhere to that line of separation. But you can't really separate the one from the other in the big picture of the legislature trying to adjourn as we head into what could emerge as the longest session in state history. You had legislators who were not going to sign on to education budgets unless they felt like they saw social justice addressed in some manner that they considered satisfactory. So that's where 377 comes into the picture, and that's why it moves so quickly through the House and the Senate.
Will legislators be trying to wait on the governor to find out if he signs this into law or not before they move on budget bills?
That's a good question. I mean, they could. And, because the procedures now at the State House, the legislature is, expected now to stay in session while waiting for the governor to finish either signing or vetoing legislation. So there hasn't been any movement on the big education budgets yet, and it's not clear when that will happen. Right now, the House is what we're waiting on, because the House is sitting on several education budget bills separate from the teacher budget. There are other pieces of that K-12 budget that are sitting on the House floor waiting for a vote. Hasn't happened over the course of the last several days.
We're joined by Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News, talking about Making the Grade and specifically what's going on at the State House. Kevin, as you all know, here on Making the Grade, when we're live across the Idaho News 6 platforms on social media, we love to take viewer comments and questions if you have them. So I wanted to bring in Harvey's comment here. He is saying, teach kids how to think, don't program them. And coming off of this, if you have a chance, everyone, to go to idahoednews.org, there are a number of really fascinating, interesting commentaries, voices, as you call them, that you put up on your web platform, Kevin, from everybody talking about this critical race theory, social justice issue in the K-12 program in particular. And I found some of the teachers' voices to be really fascinating about what they said as well.
Right, and I'd like to emphasize that that's an open forum. We take voices, pieces from all perspectives. Anybody who has an opinion on an education topic, on an education policy topic, or on these budget bills, we're open to submissions from anybody in the community.
Let's move to the higher education budget, which again, JFAC had to rewrite after it was sent back to them from the House. And where does that stand right now? We know that we've reported that Governor Little wanted about $315, I believe it was, $1 million for the higher education budget. Where does this go now that JFAC rewrote it?
Well, it goes to the House and the Senate for a vote, but what came out of JFAC on Tuesday is a smaller budget. Here we're talking about $313 million of tax money for higher education. And I draw that distinction because higher education also gets about as much money from tuition and fees from students and parents as they do from state tax dollars. So the state tax dollars comprise about half of overall higher education spending. But yes, JFAC took $2.5 million away from 3 universities and gave $400,000 to Lewis Clark State College. The cuts, and the largest cut was directed at Boise State University, is again, these are cuts that all kind of go back to this whole debate over social justice and critical race theory. JFAC wanted to make deeper cuts, and deeper cuts than I talked about even a month ago. So will that be enough to satisfy legislators? This is still a really, you're going to thread the needle or try to thread the needle in terms of getting a higher education budget through the House. And here's why. The cut of a couple $1 million from the higher education budget, that might not be enough to satisfy conservatives who want to see even deeper cuts in the higher education budget. There was an attempt in JFAC to cut $20 million out of the higher ed budget. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't even come up for a vote. But if that sentiment is reflective of where House conservatives are on this higher education budget, I'm not sure a $2 million cut is going to be enough to satisfy them. But also a $2 million cut is going to maybe leave Democrats, and there are only 12 Democrats in the House, but if you're talking about a close vote, 12 Democrats out of 70, they have a voice here. Democrats voted against that budget in committee. If they vote against it on the floor, it's going to be a hard time getting something through the House still. So, no guarantees that this is the budget that gets through the House and gets through the Senate and gets to the governor's desk.
And as we've talked about over the last week or so on Making the Grade here, Kevin, the State Board of Education has already made the decision, along with the universities, that, as you were talking about with tuition, fees, everything is going into a freeze next year for students, once again, at Idaho's higher education, universities, and colleges. Even before a budget was set, the State Board of Education voted to make that decision. So how are people reacting now that they're starting to see numbers perhaps cut out of the higher education budget? Who are you hearing from, and what are they saying?
Well, I think what you're hearing from the governor's office and from the State Board of Education is, I think there's a little bit of acceptance that this may be the best budget that they can get out of the legislature at this stage of the game, assuming that they indeed get this through the legislature. But also continuing the commitment that the state board made recently that the tuition freeze will stay in effect for another year for undergraduate students in state.
I want to bring in, there's a comment here from Beaver Mark. And Kevin, I don't know if you know what this is, but he's asking the question, what happened to the lottery money? So there was some debate over what would happen with state funds from the lottery. Powerball, I believe, yes, if I'm correct, whether or not that money, which is funneled into the schools, most of it, if not a good portion of it, funneled into the schools, what the legislature decided to do there. Do you know the answer to this question?
Yes, I do, actually. So what happened here, and it really has little to do with the legislature, is Powerball will remain in place in Idaho, at least until next year. Which means that the money from Powerball, and we're talking about $14 million for buildings and schools, about $9 million for schools, about $5 million for state buildings, that money will continue to flow into those coffers because Powerball will continue in Idaho. What this all came down to, just to kind of recap it, is Powerball, this multi-state lottery, is looking to go multinational, and the plan was for Powerball to start selling tickets in the United Kingdom and in Australia. But in order for Idaho to remain in the Powerball compact, as it becomes this more of a global compact, the legislature had to sign off. Legislators were reluctant to do so. A bill to do this was shot down in the House State Affairs Committee. Concerns about being part of this multinational compact, concerns about the lottery itself, a whole lot of issues raised. And that's what put the Powerball revenue in jeopardy. So it's a one-year reprieve, I guess you could say, for schools and buildings. The money will flow for one more year. This will become an issue that we'll certainly revisit in the 2022 session.
Of course, because the money is tied to education.
Right, and the plans to turn Powerball into a multinational compact, that plan isn't going away, apparently. There's still, the organizers of the game want to sell tickets abroad. They want to sell tickets, and build this global lottery brand, I guess. So the issue isn't going away, but for this year, it's resolved.
We really appreciate your comments and questions. Again, if you have some for us, let us know. We will try and get to them. We do know, Kevin, that $40 million of federal funding will not be coming to Idaho schools because the House denied federal funding for schools when it comes to COVID testing. This was pretty contentious debate.
Contentious and surprising. This was a bill that came out of JFAC earlier this session, went through the Senate with overwhelming support. There were only 3 no votes in the Senate. Came up for a House vote on Tuesday. Well, you can see the roll call there. It failed, fairly convincingly. 41 no votes out of 69 votes cast. A lot of concerns that were raised about privacy. Is this going to be a data mining exercise? The testing two things to emphasize about the testing. It would have been optional. And in this case, it would have been federally funded. We're not talking about state dollars. We're talking about federal COVID funding. But you still had a lot of concerns raised and really some misinformation that came out in the debate. Suggestions that somehow the COVID testing is somehow linked to the COVID vaccine or requiring a COVID vaccine. Well, first of all, as we all know, right now the COVID vaccine is not approved for anybody under age 16. Now that may change over time, but right now, if you're under 16, you can't get a vaccine anyway. And as we also know, and I don't see this changing anytime soon, the state does not require vaccinations for school attendance. Parents can still opt out of the vaccines that are available to kids. Mumps, rubella, whooping cough, all of those more traditional vaccines that have been around for years. Parents can still opt their kids out of that, and we have some of the highest opt-out numbers in the nation. So the idea that we're on our way to a mandatory, COVID vaccine for kids, that just doesn't wash with me. It doesn't seem to make any sense with what we've got in state policy. And you had, again, misinformation on the House floor. Tammy Nichols, a Republican from Middleton, suggested that kids are not spreading coronavirus. I mean, there is spread from kids. And I mean, now, case numbers for kids are, proportionally lower than what we've seen for adults and older adults. That's true. But the idea that, the virus can't be spread from kids to, adults, that doesn't really mesh with the science either.
So what happens to the $40 million the feds were offering up to Idaho? Does that money go back into some coffer that Idaho can use in some other way, or was this directly tied to school COVID testing and we lose out?
The short answer is that if this stands, if there's no attempt to try to get this through the legislature again, the money goes away, and no, it can't be used for another purpose.
Okay, well, that'll be fascinating to watch. Do you think, do I dare ask this question of you, Kevin? Do you think there's enough time to see this issue get revisited? And I have to laugh because what are we, day 100 and I don't even remember, 7, 8?
We're 108.
Okay.
Today's 108. The longest session is 118 days, so we're 10 days out from that.
So is there time for new legislation?
I think it really just depends, on the will of legislators, because there are still a lot of issues that need to be resolved. We've talked about the education budgets. You still have issues of tax policy, and the Senate has been reluctant to take up tax legislation until they see some movement from the House on budgets. You have this debate going on between the legislative branch and the governor over emergency powers. That still hasn't been resolved. And when the Senate comes back on Friday from this brief recess that they're in, they're expected to take up a veto override of one of the emergency powers bills. Those are issues that are still unresolved. Transportation is an issue that's still unresolved. Another issue that's emerged is the ethics investigation involving Representative Aaron Von Ellinger and an allegation of sexual assault. That's the issue that's consuming the session today. The House isn't going into session, the Senate isn't going into session. House Ethics Committee is holding a hearing on that. So there is a lot going on that still has to be resolved before this session can adjourn. So to your question about any other legislation that might emerge at the last minute, it's not outside the realm of possibility.
Kevin, we appreciate everything you and the folks at Idaho Education News do every single day to make sure that not only the legislature is being covered, but all of the hot topics. And I know we've missed things. So if people have interest in specifically, I loved the story that was posted about kindergarten programs throughout Idaho and who is supporting all-day kindergarten programs, where that money comes from, what it looks like. And plus, again, I wanted to put in a request for voices contributions, because it's important that not only our voices as journalists get heard, but the public's voices get heard. And Idaho Ed News does an excellent job of making sure that that is covered from the rightest of right to the leftist of left, because education in Idaho, unfortunately, for some people, does mean politics, and that's why the two crossover. So I think it's really important that people know that all of that information is there.
Yes. Yes. So, yep. Keep those submissions coming, and keep watching us as we navigate the rest of the session.
However long it may be. Kevin, thank you again for being here, for making the grade. If anybody wants to see all of these stories and much more, you go to idahoednews.org. Of course, Idaho News 6 does reposts all the time of the work that they're doing as well. Kevin, have a great day. And I know you are fully vaccinated, my friend, at the end of the week.
Friday, I get out of vaccine jail, and it's...
And get to head to the State House.
It's a relief for me. The rest of my family is going to be fully vaccinated by the end of this week too. So, it's a sigh of relief. We can start to take some baby steps back towards a little bit more normal life.
Well, and who knew you'd get to go back to the State House and actually see things in action?
No, I didn't expect that. But as things wind down at the session, it will be good to be, comfortably covering it in person. So I'll be there starting on Friday.
Fantastic. Kevin, thanks again for your time. Everybody, have a great day. Thanks for watching Making the Grade.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for watching all.